So, Yishar Koach to everyone who braved the weather to get here this morning. It is quite the adventure, exactly. I don't blame you. I hope so. All right, I hope it measures up. Yeah, that would be nice. Okay, so we're going to it's a little bit of a two-part shiur today. We're going to start with clothing in Megillat Esther, which really almost reads like highlights of the Megillah, because it has really, at almost every significant stage in the Megillah, we find clothing playing a role in the story. And the second part of the shiur, we'll just talk a little bit about costumes on Purim. Based on all the things we've learned about the significance of clothing, why on Purim do we choose to change our clothing and look differently present ourselves differently to the world? So beginning with Megillat Esther, the first time we see clothing mentioned is really biremiza. It's only hinted at, and it's the hint is sort of derived in two different ways by Chazal. The first is the Gemara in Masachet Megillah states, Bahar oto et osher kvod malchuto, when Achashverosh was making his big feast and showing off all of the grandeur and the wealth of his kingdom, Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina melamed shelavash bigdei kehuna, that at that time he wore the bigdei kehuna that had been stolen from the Beit HaMikdash when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, brought to Bavel, and ended up now in the Persian Empire, to which he was not quite the rightful heir, but he had taken the throne of the Babylonian Empire, had now been transferred to him. Ktiv hacha, how do we know that he wore the bigdei kehuna? Because here it says he showed off Yikar Tiferet Gedulato, the preciousness and the glory of his greatness, of his great malchut. Uchtiv hatam, and there, with regard to bigdei kehuna, it says, as we well know, lechavod v'letifaret. So when this word tifaret is like a code word, if he's showing off something that's tiferet, then it must be the bigdei kehuna. That's the Gemara in Masachet Megillah. And the Menot HaLevi, which is a very famous source for this idea, the Menot HaLevi is a commentary on Megillat Esther written by Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of the composer, really, of Lecha Dodi. So he wrote a commentary on Megillat Esther, and he wrote that he quotes Rabbi Eliezer Migermeza, Zichrono Lebracha, who was a 10th century teacher in Worms in Germany, one of the teachers of Rashi even. Katav chor, the word chor, where it describes the hangings, the wall hangings in the palace of Achashverosh at the party. Chur karpasu tchelet. Chur chet rabati. The word chur is written with an enlarged chet. Certainly on the parchment Megillah, it has to be written that way, and some of the printed texts show it as well. The chur is enlarged. Why? Shelavash chet bigdei kehuna. Again, this is a hint to the fact that Achashverosh wore chet, the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol. She'ein chavar kamohu. There's no disgrace, debasement as great as what he did. Shehevi hameil mi Beit HaMikdash, that he took the me'il from the Beit HaMikdash and wore it at this feast, the whole point of which was to glorify materialism. He's showing off this, look at the material wealth of my malchut, of my kingdom. And this feast was a very, we know he called in Vashti Beketer Malchut. I didn't bring that as a source for clothing because it's really, right, Beketer Malchut, and Chazal say only Beketer Malchut, that he intended for her to display her beauty before everybody. It's all about physical beauty, material, success and excess, really. And at such a display, he dared to wear the bigdei kehuna, which we learned were a symbol of the dignity of the Kohen Gadol, someone who stands in service of Hashem. To say that this clothing was lechavod v'letifaret, it was kavod to the person who wore it and tifaret to Hashem. It was an honor to Hashem, and to take that very garment and wear it at this mishteh, and that the Jews were present at such an occasion. That is a terrible, terrible debasement. And that's how the Megillah opens up, with this message of how Achashverosh had completely perverted the holiness, things that were holy, and turned them into objects, just mere objects of material success. The idea of his wearing Bigdei Kehuna clearly was a strong Masorah, and we have two different sources as to how it's derived. Where do we see a written source for this idea? But whenever you have this kind of suggestion that the Gemara brings the source from one place, and then there's a Midrash that sources it in another place, clearly there's a very strong Masorah. There's an oral transmission. This is what happened. Achashverosh wore the Bigdei Kehuna. Now going back, where can we read that? Where can we find some allusion to that in the text? And that's why you have two different sources for this derivation. But the fact that he wore the Bigdei Kehuna and used them in that way, that seems to be a very strong Masorah. The next time we see clothing in Megillat Esther is in Perek Daled. Umordechai yada et kol asher na'asa. This is following the Gezeirah of Haman. Haman, Vashti has been executed. Haman has been elevated to his new position and decreed that everybody bow down to him. Mordechai didn't bow down to him, and it was because he was Jewish. So he did his whole, came up with this whole plot of killing the Jews, and drew his lottery, went to the king, got his permission, etc. Mordechai yada et kol asher na'asa. Mordechai knew about all this. Vayikra Mordechai et begadav vayilbash sak va'efer. Mordechai tore his clothing and wore sackcloth and ashes. Vayetzei betoch ha'ir vayizak ze'aka gdola u'mara. And he went out into the streets of the city, crying a loud and bitter cry. This is one of the psukim we read to the tune of Eicha. It's a mournful pasuk. And he comes ad lifnei sha'ar hamelech, up to the gate of the king's palace. He's not into the chatzer, ki ein lavo el sha'ar hamelech bilvush sak, because you can't enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. Uv'chol medina u'medina, and everywhere where the word reached of the Gzeirah, Evel gadol laYehudim v'tzom u'v'chi u'misped. The Jews were in great mourning. They fasted, they cried, they eulogized. Sak va'efer yutza larabim. And many people donned sackcloth and ashes. And then Esther's na'arot, her servant girls, come and tell her, and she's very distressed. Vatitchalchal hamalka, difficult term. Me'od. Vatishlach begadim lehalbish et Mordechai. So what does she do? She's upset. What exactly is she upset about? We would think she's upset about the Gzeirah, about what's going on. The first thing she does, she sends clothing so that Mordechai can change his clothes. Lahasir sakome alav, take off your sackcloth. Velo kibel, and he refused to accept it. So what's really going on here? She's not. It doesn't make sense to say that what she's upset about is that he doesn't look nice. He's not well dressed. So why is she sending him a change of clothing? Also, she could have sent him a message: go home and change your clothes and come back. It's not like Mordechai doesn't have clothing. So what's going on? What's really going on here? So first of all, Rav Hirsch comments on Bereshit, and again, we should have done this last week had we not had election day in the middle, but what can we do? So what's the source? This is from the first time that we see someone tear his clothing in Tanach is where? By Yaakov tears his clothing when he hears of Yosef's presumed death, right? His sons bring the Ktonet Pasim, the Haktonet Bincha, who is this your son's Ktonet, clearly, and he says, Taraf Yosef. Yosef must have been killed, Chayara'a Achalatu. And the first thing Yaakov does is Vayikra et, there it's Simlotav, but it's the same way, he tore his clothing. So Rav Hirsch comments there. Beged, he says, to likra simla is unusual in Tanakh. Most of the time when we find torn clothing, it says vayikrat begadav. Beged hu halavush hamiyatzeget ha'adam behofa'ato hachitzonit. What is a beged? What is clothing? It represents who we are to the outside world, right? This is And again, we've talked about this, not in an ideal world, but in the real world in which we live, people judge one another by appearances, right? We were talking about this last week. You can't undo first impressions. In the first 30 seconds, when you meet someone, you've already communicated way more than probably we want to, but people judge us by what we're wearing. That's what clothing is. Hafoch kulo lema'ateh kozev, okay, the exact opposite is, we talked about this also, a traitor, a boged, is because he's identified, he presents himself one way on the outside, while inside he's really something else. So again, that beged is how we look on the outside, how we present ourselves on the outside. We think that we're looking at the true person, but really we're only seeing a beged when it comes to a boged. Hakorea et begadav mitoch tsa'ar. So someone who tears his clothing, prompted by some terrible sorrow, evel or busha, whether it's mourning, shame, harehu mivate ki eira kera biyachasav hachitzoniyim. There's some rift that he's trying to show. I feel something has been torn between me and the outside world. There's some rift that has developed between me and the outside world. Kvodo ve'oshro nifgeu. A person's sense of integrity, of his own personal dignity, has somehow been torn, has been rent, and therefore he tears his clothing. Mikan gam habitui la'avelut. This is an expression of avelut. When we talk about tearing our clothing as a form of avelut, it's an expression of I'm not relating to the outside world in my whole form. Something has torn within me, and I'm reflecting that to the outside world. So what's Esther responding to when she sees Mordechai, right? She hears only that Mordechai is standing at the king's gate in his sackcloth, and she sees that he is expressing his inner feelings to the outside world by tearing his clothing, wearing sackcloth, putting ashes on his head. And she says, this is not the way to go. Kvar Amru Chazal, if you look at Abarbanel, it's a little. Abarbanel is expressing, we'll look at the Abarbanel. Kvar Amru Chazal, Amar Rabbi Abahu, Lefi shetafas Avinu Yaakov et hasak, Lefichach lo zaz mi banav velo mi bnei banav at sof kol hadorot. Since Yaakov set this precedent of that's how we express this kind of tsa'ar, I feel rent, I feel torn on the inside, therefore I tear my clothing to express that on the outside. That stayed with us forever. He set a precedent that Mordechai followed, that many other people in Tanach followed, which we'll see next week, Bezrat Hashem, and which we still follow today. When someone is in mourning, they tear their clothing. It's an expression, it's an outward expression of how we feel on the inside, set by Yaakov Avinu, and to which we still cling. Heiru bazeh, and the underlined line, shehaita tshuvatam v'tza'akatam shel kol eila shleima kitza'akat Yaakov v'sakam kisako. Why do we cling to the minhag of Yaakov Avinu, to this custom that Yaakov Avinu established? Because it demonstrates we are like him. Just as Yaakov Avinu, when he was in mourning for his son, yes, it was avelut, but it was also tshuva. It was also, I want to get closer to Hashem. I feel like something has ripped inside of me, but if something has torn inside of me, then hopefully what we aim to do is try to repair that which has been torn. So how do we go about that? Through tshuva, through fasting, God, drawing closer to Hashem. And that's what Mordechai was trying to express. I'm tearing my clothing. I'm devastated by what's going on. And in order to repair it, I have to turn to Hashem. I have to model myself on Yaakov Avinu. Esther sends clothing, according to the Midrash, Yalkut Shimoni, source number 6, Vatishlach begadim lahalbishet Mordechai, lahasir sako me'alav, velo kibel. Why didn't he receive, why did he refuse to accept the clothing? She's trying to help him along. So most of the commentators say, what is she trying to accomplish by sending him clothing? She wants him to change his clothing so that he can enter the palace. Come in. Let's talk about this. Whether you go talk to the king, whether you come talk to me, let's make a plan. Let's employ diplomatic means and try to work with this situation, right? Yes, there's been a terrible decree that's been issued, but calm down. We have time, right? This is in the month of Nisan. The Gzeirah was not until the following Adar, so we have 11 months. Let's employ diplomatic channels. We'll think about how best to approach the king, how we can possibly get rid of this Gzeirah, have this Gzeirah repealed in a nice, calm, diplomatic, political way. And Mordechai says, no, lo kibel. Amar eini meziz hasak ad sheyaseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu nisim kshe'asa larishonim. I'm not taking off this sackcloth until Hashem does miracles for me, like he did in previous times. In earlier biblical times, we see there are times when someone donned sackcloth and ashes and tore their clothing. You find it with Achav, that he had there was a Ra'av in the time of Achav, and yes, it was his fault, and Eliyahu brought the Ra'av because of an exchange that he had with Achav. Eliyahu and Achav had met, and Achav said certain things, because of which Eliyahu decreed the drought, which led to a famine. And that famine lasted for 3 years, but at the end of 3 years, Hashem said, "Die, enough." And Achav, as much as he was a Rasha and he did terrible things, he loved OUisrael, and he was concerned for them. So the entire 3 years, he wore sackcloth, and he fasted, and he prayed to Hashem in his own way to remove the Ra'av, to end the famine. And Hashem, at the end of 3 years, said, okay, that's it. That's all they can handle. And he brought about a tremendous nisim at that time. Same thing with Yoram ben Achav, also experienced the Ra'av. And this is the outward expression. They wore the sackcloth for this outward expression of what's going on the inside, that they feel impaired somehow because of the situation, and that leads to tshuva. So Esther is saying, take off the sackcloth, don't be so dramatic, come into the palace, we'll talk this through. And Mordechai says, lo kibel, no, I am not moving until there's a nace. What's going to bring about a nace? Tshuva. He said, that's what has to happen. This is not the moment for political maneuvering. This is the moment for spiritual upheaval. We have to create a huge tshuva movement, and it has to be done dramatically, and it has to be done now. We can't wait. We can't push this off. This is a sign from Hashem. He wants us to return to him now. And I'm not taking off my sackcloth until the miraculous things start to happen. And this is Mordechai's approach, and this is where they clash. And she says, let's take our time. And he says, you have to go to the king. And she says, I don't know about that. I haven't been called in 30 days. It's been a while. Either, which is understood, either he'll call for me soon, most likely he'll call for me soon, or somehow I've fallen out of favor and it's a real risk if I go to him. And Mordechai says, this is why you are where you are. Right? Come on, seize the moment. And she comes around to his way of thinking instead of in the beginning. It's this conversation, this encounter is really the biggest turnaround in the Megillah, because until now Esther's been very passive, and from this moment on she takes charge, and she's okay, well, I'll go into the king as you wish, and in that case, lech knosset kol haYehudim, get everybody together, tell them to fast, and she starts giving him instructions. So there's a huge turnaround here. This is a very significant encounter, and really it's all set in motion by the clothing that Mordechai wears and the fact that he refuses to accept the change of clothing that she offers. She says, change your clothing, meaning change your way of thinking, and he insists, lo kibel, no, I'm not changing my way of thinking, you have to change your way of thinking, which she then does, and then even exceeds his expectations, which is, it's an amazing encounter. So what does that lead to? It leads to the next change of clothing in Perek Hey, Vayhi bayom hashlishi, vatilbash Esther malchut. Probably three of the most, all the words in the Megillah are so beautiful. I was just saying before, it's like you open Megillat Esther every year, and it's just so beautiful and so exciting and so fresh every time. So Esther vatilbash Esther malchut. She wore royalty. And she goes and stands in the Chatzar Beit HaMelech until Achashverosh notices her and sends his scepter, indicating that she's allowed to enter.
Which is also like the switch, right? The clothing is the external
right.
appearance of that.
So let's discuss how this reflects that. But yes, this is a moment in which she completely assumes her own identity and, sort of stands there in her own right with a tremendous amount of strength. I mean, what it took for her to do this, we can't even imagine. So what is this Vatilbash Esther Malchut? Of course, all the Mefarshim start with saying it should have said, right? You have the Gemara as the earliest source that I brought, Talmud Bavli, Masachet Megillah, and source number 8. Dichtiv vayhi bayom hashlishi vatilbash Esther Malchut bigdei Malchut mibaile. It should have said Vatilbash Esther bigdei Malchut. Now, Esther wrote the Megillah very carefully. Every word is very well chosen and carefully thought out. She didn't accidentally leave out a word. It didn't happen. So clearly, if she wrote Vatilbash Esther Malchut, yes, it obviously could have said Bigdei Malchut, and that would have just been, okay, she got dressed in her royal garments and she went to see the king. The fact that she left out the word tells us something else. Ella shelvashta ruach hakodesh. Malchut here is a euphemism for Ruach HaKodesh. She was enrobed in the divine spirit, in divine inspiration. And in that manner, she went to see the king. And that's why, think about this. She says to Mordechai, you tell everybody, tell them to gather, to daven, to fast. I too will daven and fast. I don't know about the rest of you, but after one day of fasting, I don't look my best. Right? She's fasting now for 3 days, and she says, Uvachein avo el hamelech. After 3 days of fasting, I'm going to go stand before the king. She can barely stand up. She's, whatever color she was originally, she's white now. Right? So, what does that mean? So, Vashta Ruach HaKodesh. She is lit up, she's illuminated from within by Ruach HaKodesh. And that's why she's so striking. When she stands there, the king sees her, and he sees this illuminated personality, not just the physical beauty that he was attracted to initially. He sees there's something shining, there's something special about her, and that's why he invites her in. Levashta Ruach HaKodesh. And the Gemara in Masachet Megillah, there is a proof text that elsewhere, Ktiv Hatam, in Divrei Hayamim, it says, V'ruach lavsha et amasai, that the shoresh, lavash, is used in connection with ruach, with a spirit illuminating someone from within. But the Megillah here quotes this pasuk, Vatilbash Esther Malchut. The context is, that's the proof that Esther was a Neviah. Vatilbash Esther Malchut. She wore Malchut, she wore Ruach HaKodesh. She's a Neviah. From here we learn. So that's what it means. That's the first explanation of she wore Ruach HaKodesh. She was enrobed. She was, again, illuminated from within by Ruach HaKodesh. Batilbash Malchut. Malchut means Ruach HaKodesh. The Alshich says something fascinating. Vayhi bayom hashlishi, lomar, hine ad ko haya hamalchut bilti naut leEsther. Until now, her royal position was uncomfortable, putting it mildly, for Esther. Right? Lama? שהייתה גולה וסורה ככל נשי ישראל אשר בגלות מדי ואיכה תצלח למלוכה. She was in galut to begin with. She's in a downtrodden, sorry state to begin with. And then she ends up in the palace. Galut betoch galut. Right? She is the Hester betoch ha-Hester. She is absolutely in the most awful, horrible position. She's, even with Mordechai walking outside, Ladat, Me'amaye al-Seba, she's in this, she's surrounded by such degradation. I mean, the women surrounding her are the lowest, it's the lowest of the low. And he sees what's happening outside, right? And he's the Gzeirah, and all of a sudden, Mordechai realizes she wasn't taken there for no reason. Like, okay, maybe we thought superficially it seemed like, she's beautiful, so she was chosen in this beauty context. What was Hashem thinking? What was Hashem's plan? And then all of a sudden, 1 second, now there's this terrible gzeirah, but we have someone on the inside. Esther is in the palace. Maybe she can somehow help, and maybe not only maybe can she help, but mi yodea imla'it kazot higat lamalchut. This is why you're there, he says to her. You're being there. You were so, feeling this keli, lama azavtani. Chazal say that the Mizmor, Ayelet HaShachar, was written with Esther in mind, and this was her tefillah, keli, lama azavtani. I feel so lost and abandoned here. You've been feeling lost and abandoned, but one second, there's a reason for this. This is why you have reached the Malchut. And that's why when Esther went to Achashverosh, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, she wore her royalty, literally, the royalty to which she had been unwillingly chosen, but she embraced it for the first time. She accepted the fact, I am the queen. I am Achashverosh's queen. And therefore I can go into him and maybe work from the inside. This is why I'm there. So she embraced her royalty. She wore her royalty, her real Persian royalty, for the first time. It's the first time that she said, I'm comfortable. Comfortable with it, but I accept this, that this is my destiny to be the Persian queen, and I can channel it and use it in a positive way. The Torah Tamima quotes the Midrash Rabbah on Parshat Vayera, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, should have said Bigdei Malchut, Ella Shelavsha Malchut Beit Aviha. She wore the Malchut that was hers by biological right. Who's Aviha? Who's Malchut Beit Aviha? Shaul. She wore the Malchut of Shaul. Hamefarshim nidchaku bebeur drasha zo. Says the Torah Tamima, Rav Epstein, the Mefarshim struggle with the explanation of this phrase, with this idea. V'li nira pashut. It seems very simple. Dilavashta malchut beit aviha shehu Shaul. It clearly, we're talking about Shaul. Why? As we said earlier, Ish Yehudi, Demi Shaul Ba'a, Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habira, Shmo Mordechai, Ben Yair, Ben Shemi, Ben Kish, Ish Yemini. He's Mishevet Ben Yamin, descended from Kish, like Shaul. Ukemo LeShaul, Nimsar Dvar Ovdan Amalek, Kach Levashta Ata, Esther Ruach Ze, Leha'avid et Haman Ha'amaleki. She embraced the role of her forebear, Shaul, the Malchut, and his royal mission, which was to have eradicated Amalek. Why are we left with Haman ha'agagi? Because Shaul left Agag alive. Esther is the tikkun for that. And that's why Mordechai says to her, if you don't act in this moment, don't worry, the Jews will be saved. What's going to happen to you? At ubeit avich tovedu. Ma kesher beit avich. Why your father's house? You're going to get rid of your father's house? What is that? What is your father's house? Because this is your opportunity, l'taken, to be a tikkun for Shaul. You have to get rid of Amalek because he left Amalek alive. And if you do, then that's going to be a tremendous tikkun. And if you don't, atu beit avich tovedu, we're going to lose this last final opportunity that Hashem is giving us as the descendants of Shaul to eradicate Amalek. So that's the malchut that she embraced. So you have three different approaches, but Tilvash Esther, malchut, she wore malchut, means she took on, of course it should have said Bigdei Malchut, but what did Bigdei Malchut represent in this instance? Either her own Malchut as Queen of Persia, or the Malchut of the mission that she, as the royal descendant of Shaul, was assigned to eradicate Amalek, or Ruach HaKodesh, that she was enrobed in this illuminating spirit of divine spirit, which empowered her to go into Achashverosh and be welcomed into his chamber. The next time, of course, we see Levush Malchut is in every child's favorite story, I think, in the Megillah. This is the part that the kids wait for. That Achashverosh, there's not a lot of parshanut on this because it is what it is. Vayomer Haman el HaMelech, right? Haman had gone into the king to ask permission to hang Mordechai. He was so excited that he couldn't wait until morning. He went in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, Chazal tell us that Achashverosh had been having these disturbing dreams in which Haman was trying to steal his crown, and then in walks Haman in the middle of the night. And he had meanwhile the king had his record books brought in to be read to him, to soothe him, and bedtime stories. Let me hear about my great feats and accomplishments, and what they kept reading about Bigtan and Teresh and how his life had been saved. And it all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, what was done to honor this man who saved my life? And nothing. There's no record of anything having been done. And in walks Haman at that very moment, and Hashem says, Hashem is orchestrating things behind. That's Valayla hahu nadadashnat hamelech is Hashem. So Hashem is certainly orchestrating the fact that Haman walked in at just that instant. And he says to Haman, what should be done? Vayomer Haman laish asher hamelech chafetz bikaro. And Haman, Vayomer Haman el hamelech. And Haman says to himself, Ish asher hamelech chafetz bikaro. Who else if not me? So wow, okay, let's sing. Ish asher hamelech chafetz bikaro. This is what should be done. Vayaviu levush malchut asher lavash bo hamelech. Royal clothing which the king himself has worn. V'sus asher rachav alav hamelech v'asher natan keter malchut barosho. And a horse upon which the king has ridden. And keter malchut, a crown, should be placed on his head. And here at this point, the Mefarshim say that Achashverosh's face was starting to get a little bit expressing concern, and Haman sees that he's walking on thin ice here when it comes to the keter. So keter malchut, yasher nitan keter malchut birosho. It's a little bit unclear. He didn't want to say, on my head, because the king is getting annoyed. He says on his head. It's left a little bit unclear. Some Mefarshim say maybe he meant the horse's head. The horse should wear the keter malchut, which is even more insulting, perhaps. But at any rate, Achashverosh is not happy with that situation, and in the end we see the keter malchut is left out. So, this is what was done. The clothing, the horse, was all brought, and Haman had to dress Mordechai and lead him through the streets. And, excuse me, after which Mordechai returns to the Shar HaMelech, and Haman returns nidchaf el beito avel v'chafui rosh. Right? And the Midrash says Haman's daughter had looked out the window and assumed that it would be Mordechai leading Haman through the streets, so she threw the contents of the chamber pot on the head of the person leading the horse, and it turned out to be her father, which is why he comes home avel v'chafui rosh. If you have a good balkore. Okay. Yes. At any rate, levush malchut, so Haman specifies, levush malchut asher lavash bo hamelech. Who's going to know if the king wore his clothing? You think the people out in the streets who are going to see him passing by can say, oh, I saw the king wearing that just yesterday, right? No. So levush malchut, that's a clear signal to everybody who's watching this parade. This person is, wow, the king wants to honor him. Asher lavash bo hamelech, who's feeling that? The person wearing only the person wearing the clothing, and Haman and Achashverosh, it's a very small circle of people who are going to know that this is clothing asher lavash bo hamelech, that the king had worn. So really the impact is felt by the wearer. I am something special. And that's what Haman wanted for himself. I want to wear clothing the king himself has worn, because that's going to make me like, I'm the king. I'm wearing the king's clothes that he wore. And somehow his essence was expressed through these garments. I'm going to be that person. I'm going to be, in those moments, it's like, I'm the king. But what happens afterwards? So Mordechai ends up wearing the clothing, right? Asher lavash bo hamelech. But what does he do? Vayashov Mordechai el Shar HaMelech. And Chazal say, V'hainu dichtiv Vayashov Mordechai el Shar HaMelech, Amar Rav Sheshet, Sheshav l'sako u'leta'anito. He went right back to who he was. He was not impacted. Clothing for Mordechai didn't work from the outside in. Haman was saying, from the outside, that's going to mark who I am on the inside. And Mordechai said, no, who I am on the outside, how I express who I am, that comes from within, not the other way around. And he's not changed by having worn these garments, even though Achashverosh himself had worn them. And that was meant to impact him. He says, it doesn't work that way. It goes from the outside in, from the inside out, not the outside in. And he goes back to his sackcloth and ashes, because for him, it's not about his own glory. For Haman, it was all about his own glory. What was it about for Mordechai? The Gzeirah is still in effect. Nothing has changed. Until that, and remember what he had said, until the Gzeirah is changed, until there's a nace, I'm not taking off my sackcloth. So he had no choice in this instance. The king said, okay, he had to, but as soon as he was done, he goes back to his sackcloth and ashes, because that's the expression of who he is and what he's about. His concern is for Klal Yisrael, not for himself. Then things change. Okay, finally, the Gzeirah is repealed, and in Perek Chet, Mordechai yatzami lifnei hamelech belevush malchut. Again, you have levush malchut. Mordechai goes out in royal clothing. Tchelet v'chur v'ateret zahav gdola v'tachrich butz v'argaman v'ha'ir Shushan tzahalav v'samecha. Lahudim hayta ora v'simcha v'sason v'yikar. Mishpetzot zahav says here, michudushay haran. We see, he asks the question, Harav Mibrisk asks the question, Mordechai yatzami lifnei hamelech belevush malchut tchelet v'chur v'chulei v'ha'ir Shushan tzahalav v'samecha v'lichora. אין הכוונה שהעיר שושן צהלה ושמחה, על שמרדכי היה בלבוש מלכות תכלת וחור. Right? It sounds like, wow, they saw him wearing beautiful clothing and whoa, they're happy. Yay, Mordechai's wearing nice clothes. That's not, again, it's not what it's about. It's not about the superficial clothing on the outside. And it's tzahala v'samecha, like this is huge. It's a big simcha. It's not that like, oh, they smiled and said, oh, that's cute, nice. They tzala v'samecha, ora v'simcha, sason v'yikar. Ela dehem shnei dvarim nifradim. There are two things going on here. Achein mishoshanat Yaakov tzala v'samecha bir'otam yachad tchelet Mordechai. Shoshanat Yaakov makes it sound the same way. Like bir'otam, well, they were tzala v'samecha when they saw the tchelet of Mordechai. Hareisha hasimcha hayta al shera'ui tchelet Mordechai v'hakol davar echad. It seems like it's all that they were happy about the clothing, but sarich beyur. This needs to be explained. So what's the explanation? The explanation is, again, Mordechai is only concerned with the Gzeirah against the entire Klal Yisrael. And the time that the Gzeirah was not repealed, he couldn't be happy. So when they saw, and everybody knew this, because again, his Sak Va'efer was led to Sak Va'efer Yutzal Arabim. Many people followed Mordechai's example. Kevan shera'u, I'm on the last line of the second paragraph. To kevan shera'u shemordechai hesir sako v'lavash bigdei malchut ra'u be'alil shebetela hagzera v'kara hanes. That was the signal. It's not that they saw the clothing and said, oh, wow, Mordechai finally found a good tailor. They saw the clothing and said, well, if Mordechai took off his sackcloth and he on his own, look how he's walking the streets, bilavush malchut, not as a function of the king's decree led by someone, because that's an artificial situation. But on his own, he is willingly walking the streets, bilavush malchut, tchelet v'chur, and clearly the nace has occurred, the gzeirah is repealed, now we can truly rejoice. So it's again the expression on the outside of what's going on the inside. Then he brings a beautiful drasha, Katav Rav Moshe David Vali Zatzal, Ki HaMelech Hashav La'asot Lo Kavod Lefi Sha'ah, Al Yedei Haman. When the king dressed him up in the king's clothing, it was intended as a temporary, momentary thing. Lefi Sha'ah. Ve'Hashem Yiparach Gazar La'asot Lo Kavod Shel Ha'amada, V'Kiyum. Hashem's intention was, this should be lasting. This is not just a momentary, moment of glory. He had the moment in the sun, and now everything goes back to the way it was. No, Hashem intended for there to be real change, and that's when the sack gets removed. And in place of the sackcloth, he gets the levush malchut. And in place of the efer, he gets the crown of malchut. Because one who feels the pain of Klal Yisrael merits to feel the redemption of Klal Yisrael. And that's really the message here. Lo l'mara'ei nayim bilvad. It's not just a superficial wearing of clothing. Ki nishtanu mamash libushei nishmato. The clothing of his neshama changed. That his neshama was in so much pain for the pain of Klal Yisrael that he could only wear sackcloth and ashes. But in the merit of his having worn sackcloth and ashes, for having felt the pain of Klal Yisrael, that's the merit in which he gets to wear levush malchut, not just for a few minutes going around town, led by Haman on the king's horse, but really from now his whole position changes. He's Mishneh LaMelech, appointed over the household of Haman, etc. He's even in a position to put taxes on the people, which the last pasuk, which now has become a minhag Yisrael to boo when the tax is mentioned. But as we'll see, minhag Yisrael TORAH. So to build the Beit HaMikdash, yes, and now we boo them. It's we need to revisit some of our minhagim. Yes, contemporary minhagim. Yeah, I wanted to spend a few minutes on Tachposet, but that's Megillat Esther. Is that the conclusion of Megillat Esther is really, it's the turnaround, because that's the whole theme of Megillat Esther, right? V'na'afochu. It's used, so the sackcloth turns to levush malchut, and that's just emblematic of what happens throughout the entire story.
I just want to ask, why is there you say that Esther has
The green complexion. Okay, how much time do you have? Yeah. Okay, so the greenish complexion is explained in a few ways. The Maharal, I'll give you quickly, the Maharal says that green is the perfect balance between white and black. It's the exact center between white and black, and it shows that Esther was very balanced. She had a very balanced personality. It talks about this in a few different ways. The Hadass, that also the Hadass is, the Gemara says the Hadass is Beinoni, so she wasn't too much of one thing, too much of another. She didn't go to any extreme, and everybody was drawn to her because of that, because everybody found something in her that they could connect to. And we're always drawn to people who sort of exude a sense of personal harmony, of menuchat hanefesh, and that's one explanation for the greenness of her complexion, which is, I'm good. So there are, it's a green like the Hadass, but no, so the Maharal does not take it literally. There is another paper that says that she was green from the whole experience of being taken to the palace, and that she was literally green, but Achashverosh batimsa chen be'inav, that she had a certain chen that transcended the greenness. That the chen of Esther, the Rav, I've quoted this before here, I'm sure, the Rav Soloveitchik has the most beautiful definition of chen, which is that it is an outer reflection of the person's tzelem Elokim. And that, like, when you looked at Esther, you saw her tzelem Elokim. And that's what the king was sort of taken by. Not necessarily, she wasn't, look, there were a lot of beautiful women there. Even if she was exceptionally beautiful, which the Gemara does say that she was, she might not have looked her best at that moment, and there were other beautiful women. But her beauty was associated with chen, which is the outer reflection of what's inside of the Tzelem Elokim. Okay, so that's two explanations for the greenness. There are more, but okay. I'm passionate about Megillat Esther. I'm passionate about all of Tanach, but Megillat Esther is like number one in my heart, I think, if I'm allowed to say such a thing. And I guess you can see that. Okay. Why do we wear costumes on Purim? So very, very quickly, the earliest mention of costumes on Purim is in the writings of Mahari Mintz, Rabbi Yehuda Levi Mintz of Padua, Italy. Fascinating life story. He lived a very long time. Died at 103. Right, like within the same week as the Abarbanel, who was also living in Italy at that time. The Abarbanel came from Spain. Mahari Mintz came originally from Germany. So it's the intersection of two worlds. In Italy, post-the Spanish expulsion, the Abarbanel had been a member of the Spanish court and went to Italy following the expulsion from Spain. And they died just days apart and are buried right next to each other. So you have two worlds converging over there. The Abarbanel was 71. He was a relatively young man. He died very disappointed, very bitter, because he had been convinced that the Spanish expulsion and the Inquisition that followed were Chavlei Mashiach, and that Mashiach was going to arrive, and he died very disappointed that Mashiach had not come. And Mahari Mintz died at 103, which I can't even imagine in the 1500s to live to 103. Like, people must have, like, I don't know, somehow idolized him, because for such a person to have seen so much, to be walking the streets, wow. At any rate, he has a tshuva about costumes on Purim, and that's the earliest written source that we have that deals with it. And he talks about simcha, that it's associated with simchat Purim. That's why we wear it as a an expression of the joy of Purim. People wear costumes to like contribute to the spirit of happiness. I did bring a source from Tanach. Sorry, I left this one little source from Tanach for the root of the word tachposet, vayitchapes Shaul. This is the first time we talked about last time that maybe we know that Yaakov wore Esav's clothing, he's disguised, and it's the first time we see the word lehitchapes in Tanakh, the root of the same word that we use in contemporary language Hebrew to mean tachposet, vayitchapes Shaul vayilbash bgadim achirim vayelech hu ushnei anashim imo vayavo el ha'isha laila. This is when he goes to the Eshet Balat Ha'ov and he wants to raise Shmuel Hanavi from the dead at the end of his life. And he's not in good straits, and he needs Shmuel's advice. So vayitchapes Shaul, where does the word come from? Mahu vayitchapes Shaul, shenaasa chofshi lamalchut. Vayitchapes Shaul naasa chofshi lamalchut vayilbash begadim achirim. He became free of the malchut. He's no longer king. If he's not wearing the king's clothes, he's no longer the king. He's free of the restraints that being king put on his behavior. And now he could behave like just anybody. So I think that's what Mahari means. And then there's a second source, which is also an earlier source, Vayitchapes Shaul v'gomer mahu Vayitchapes Shaul. This was printed from a manuscript. It's just a fragment. Shena'asa chofshi min hamitzvot umin hamalchut. He really takes it far, that he was chofshi min hamitzvot, and which is what allowed him to go employ a necromancer, because that is certainly not okay halachically. So he freed himself of of all his obligations, and I think that the Ma'ari Mintz that's what he's alluding to when he says we wore costumes on Purim, and he just says that this is a minhag that I've seen in the homes of my teachers, which he came from Germany. So this is an Ashkenazic minhag. We don't see costumes on Purim in Sephardic halachic literature until much, much later. It's emerged as an Ashkenazi minhag, either in Germany or in Italy, and that it's associated, at least initially, with sort of having a certain freedom of expression. It's like getting drunk on Purim, right? So wearing costumes is a different way of doing that. Like, I'm going to take on this other identity, which is going to free me to express myself in ways that I don't normally feel. Normally, I feel a little bit restrained, confined by who I am and what people might think. So if I put on a mask and people don't recognize me, I can be a little bit more free in my behavior, obviously within halachic limitations, and that's something that comes up a lot in halachic literature. Is it permissible for men to wear women's clothing and vice versa? And Sephardim are much more makpid on that than Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim is, if it's clear that it's done for the sake of Purim and all the other laws of tzniut are complied with, which is a significant piece to bear in mind, then it's okay in Ashkenazic circles. Sephardim, Rav Ovadia was very against the idea of men wearing women's clothing and vice versa, even on Purim. Yeah.
Does anybody connect it to chipus in the
In other words, yeah, so I think it is connected, like to search for your own identity, right? The hitpa'el makes it reflexive. So chipus, I'm searching for who I really am and sort of letting that out, not being restrained by anything that's holding you back on the outside. Other comments about, so the Shulchan Aruch, and again, it's not in the Shulchan Aruch itself, but it's in the comments of the Ramah, because the Shulchan Aruch is Sephardic halacha. It's mentioned only in a gloss of the Ramah, because it's an Ashkenazi minhag, mashena agul lilbosh partsufim bepurim, the minhag of wearing masks on Purim. V'gever lovesh simulat isha v'isha kli gever ein isur badavar me'achar she'ein mechuvanin ela l'simcha be'alma. It's only a matter, it's just a way of rejoicing freely, similar to the Mahari Mintz, and that seems to be the earliest mention of it. Bilvad shelo yasuz davar shelo kahogen al pi tovei ha'ir. You have to make sure that you're not violating customs of the city in which you live. So with respect to the people around you and what their standards may be, within those guidelines, yes, it's permissible to be a little free with our costumes on Purim. Some other beautiful, very quickly because we really have to finish, the Bnei Yissaschar again opens with Minhag Yisrael TORAH, that these are minhagim, and by the way, this comes up a lot with regard to Purim. Minhag Yisrael TORAH, same thing with the Ra'ashan, the Shulchan Aruch says, it's brought down in the Mishnah Berurah. This is Minhag Yisrael TORAH. that there's a reason why we use groggers. It's not just to, it's not like on Pesach so the children will ask questions or to keep the kids awake in shul or to get them excited, whatever. There's a real meaning to the groggers on Purim. When we hear the name of Haman, we should extra loud this year. So the Minhag Yisrael Torahu. But here, Nahagu lehishtanot b'malbushim shonim. This is a Hasidic source, Bnei Yissaschar. Bizman haseuda v'simchat Purim. Not during davening, by the way. There are tshuvas about whether or not you're allowed to wear costumes during davening. So costumes, yes. Masks, no. Based on the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he stood before Hashem, removed his veil. Right? When we stand before Hashem, it should be panim el panim. So it's okay to wear a costume as long as it's not too frivolous, but masks should be removed for davening. Okay. Anyway, he says, he brings the tshuva, and this is, again, fascinating in terms of the cultural implications. He says, I saw in the Sefer, in B'Torato Shel Harav HaMifursam, Maharam Chagiz. Maharam Chagiz is a Sephardic rabbi. He was actually Yerushalmi. He was born in Yerushalayim, but he spent a significant part of his life in Italy and Germany. So it could be that that's where he saw these customs, although he is much later. He's in the 17th century, late 17th, early 18th century even. So it could be that by then costumes had crept into the Sephardic world, but it's definitely Ashkenazi in origin. What does he write? Shehu lezecher masha amru Razal, that wearing costumes on Purim alludes to the teaching of Chazal in Masechet Megillah. Heim lo asu ela lefanim. The fact that the Jews in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, in Sefer Daniel, bowed to the tselem that Nebuchadnezzar created, to his idol, they did it without feeling in their hearts. They only went through the physical motions because they had no choice, but in their hearts they remained loyal to Hashem. Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo asa imahem ela lefanim. So too, Hashem also acted only superficially. Hashem allowed the Gzeirah of Haman to be issued, knowing that it was going to be revoked, and only in order so that Bnei Yisrael do tshuva and return to him and come back to him. It was only like a superficial structure to get them to return to Hashem. So therefore, we remember that al kein mishtanim bizman hasimcha b'malbushim shonim v'lo nikar hapanim shel mihu v'hu davar nechmad b'pashtiyut haminhag. It's a very sweet little explanation. Hashem only acted superficially, so we also put on some superficial disguise to show that inside we're really loyal to Hashem, despite what our behaviors may be. When we sin, it's not intentionally. We're not trying to rebel against Hashem. We make mistakes. And that's represented by our costumes on Purim. It says to Bnei Yissaschar, that's very nice. But there's something really much deeper going on. And here he relates it to the Ruach HaKodesh. He says that Esther wore Ruach HaKodesh. Bat Yilbash, Esther Malchut, she wore Ruach HaKodesh. And the impact that had on Achashverosh, the Midrash, he cites a Midrash from the Zohar that Achashverosh became paralyzed with fear when he saw Esther illuminated by the Ruach HaKodesh. And he had to be revived by a malach in order to welcome her in, and the whole Gzeirah and the story changed from there. And the whole Mordechai Yatzami Lifnei Hamelech Bilvush Malchut, at the end of the story, when you see the turnaround, he goes from wearing sackcloth to wearing Levush Malchut. It's the same thing, that he's wearing the Levush of Olam Haba. It was a spiritual manifestation. It's a physical manifestation of something, of a spiritual change that's occurring. And that's why on Purim, we change our clothing to reflect this idea of Atilbash Malchut, hoping that we're tapping into the spiritual core of what's happening on Purim. And we're expressing our joy through wearing costumes, but it's really an expression of the Levush Malchut and the Malbushei Yakar Ruchaniyim, Mashe Malbushim HaTzadikim Began Eden, and which again speaks to the spirit of the costumes that people should wear and what kind of costumes are appropriate and what aren't. Many of the sources talk about specifically dressing up as non-Jews. Of the Hasidic sources, especially, and in Hasidic circles, it's very common. You see it in the courts of the Rebbes. The kids dress up as Cossacks. You ever see this? And they do a Cossack dance. It's a very traditional, like, this is what they do. The Purim costume is to dress up as a Cossack. So What does that have to do with anything? So the Pachad Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Hutner explains very beautifully, Vatilbash Ester Malchut. It's in Yiddish for those who want to break your teeth a little bit. So he says, basically he says, Vatilbash Ester Malchut, he relates the two sources, Ruach HaKodesh, that she wore Ruach HaKodesh, and that she dressed in the royalty of her forebear Shaul. What's the connection? Shaul is the only king. What happens to Shaul at the beginning of his Malchut? Not quite up to there in NACH yet, but you'll hear it in a couple of days. He experiences prophecy, right? So he had both. He had Malchut in the sense of royalty and prophecy. Why does he need royalty and prophecy? Because the command to eradicate Amalek was given when you go into the land. Who is the first leader to bring us into the land upon whom fell this obligation? Yoshua. Yoshua was Melech v'Navi. Therefore, the person who's going to continue that mission, who's going to eradicate Amalek, has to be Melech v'Navi. So therefore, Shaul had to experience Nevuah, and Esther, who took on that role, who to continue the mission of Shaul, had to, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, have both royalty and Ruach HaKodesh. And he says at the end, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, the last three lines. Okay, I'll do the list. Yeah. Die Unterkehr Shura is as da is gewein idische Malchus in goyische Levushim. So she wore, right, Jewish Malchut, but she wore it in the disguise of goyische Levushim, that she wore the Malchut of Persia on the outside, but on the inside, it was really the Ruach HaKodesh and the mission of Shaul that she was accomplishing. Right? Vatilbash Esther Malchut is the Simcha from Purim in Goya Shekelim. That's why they have the mitzvah, the minhag to dress up specifically as Goyim, as non-Jews, and to say that this should be an instrument that will bring us to Geula.